But I just wanted to understand from you, like, what does it take to get to that level of healing? Because that's, people would say, okay, well, it's a 10 million population. To me, that's still a humongous win for the world.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you've seen cultures, or if you've seen even smaller groups, or even living through the war where you've seen that kind of healing before.
I don't know how the healing happened in Rwanda.
Of course.
Really encouraged to hear what you describe here. I think at the very least of it, the suffering had to be acknowledged and had to be heard and fully acknowledged. And then the healing can take place.
Yeah.
Without that, it can't.
Of course, absolutely.
Which is why it's so important to understand trauma. The suffering has to be acknowledged. Now, in my country, Canada, like when you talked about Rwanda, of course, that tribal hatred didn't just arise up from nowhere, nor is it necessarily in the nature of those people to be like that. A lot of it was the legacy of colonialism that quite deliberately, and you would know something about British colonialism, it quite deliberately set one group against another, the legacy of which was often tremendous struggle and hatred and violence. In Canada, as in the United States, the legacy of colonialism fell more particularly on our indigenous peoples, so that to this day, they suffer so much. The addiction rate is much higher amongst them. 50% of the women in jail in my country are indigenous people.
Wow.
They make up 5% of the population.
Wow.
An indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis. They never used to have rheumatoid arthritis prior to colonization. There's been some apologies in Canadian history, but there's been not sufficient acknowledgement of what actually happened and what continues to happen. And I'm saying that an essential condition for that healing would have to be acknowledgement. So the Pope came to Canada just maybe 6 weeks ago because the church cooperated with the state to abduct children from their homes, indigenous children from their homes, for over 100 years, into the 1990s, into these residential schools where our native children were not allowed to see their parents, where their culture was extirpated. They had pins stuck in their tongue if they spoke their tribal language. They were sexually abused. Often they died. They were physically abused. They were starved. And the Pope came and apologized. And you know what the apology was? I'm so sorry for what some Christians did to your people. Well, he means well as a person, but that was an apology uttered by an institution, because it wasn't, or it should have been uttered by the institution, but they said what some Christians, it wasn't some Christians, it was the state, and it was the church. And what I'm saying is that was a good first step. But until there's full acknowledgement and we are fully willing to hear the suffering of the people that we hurt, and that's why in the 12 steps, what do? They do this moral inventory. How did we hurt somebody, and how can we, without imposing on them, how can we acknowledge if that's appropriate? So I think for healing, whether for myself or people that I've hurt, there has to be acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Of the suffering itself. I think that's the first essential step.